So welcome everybody to our IASS webinar, Global South, Where and What Is It? I would like to welcome everybody. And today we're going to hear three inputs on this general theme of the Global South with a Q&A in the end. We will be checking questions in the chat, and we would also like to remind everybody that this event is being recorded. So before we head straight to the first input, let me welcome our panel. We are going to welcome Vinod Ramanarayanan. He is the holder of the International Climate Protection Fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, affiliated with the Beuth University of Applied Sciences, Berlin. Welcome, Vinod.
Thanks, Flavio.
We'll also be welcoming Luciana Balestrin. She is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the Federal University of Pelotas in Brazil. She will be joining us in a minute. And we will start with Luis Eslava. He is Reader in International Law, Director of PGR Funding and Admissions, Co-Director at the Center for Critical International Law. Welcome, Luis.
Hi, Flavio.
So we will start with Luis, and we would like to remind our panelists that they each have 15 minutes, maximum 15 minutes to make their presentations, since we have a very short time for our Q&A. So Luis, the floor is yours.
So thank you again, Flavio, and all the organizers for inviting me. So what I want to do in my quick intervention is to start from where I stand, which is international law, my field, and how traditional the question of the world has been understood in international law. For international lawyers and for international legal political institutions, the world is organized as we see it here as a planet that, as a result of the long evolution of the international legal order, has come to function and operate through the figure of the nation state. This state centrism that is characteristic of international law, as well as related fields, including international relations, and I know many of you are international relations scholars, but as well as many other fields, that state centrism is extremely important because it has an impact in terms of how we understand the history of our places, how we understand ourselves, how we understand the legal systems that are important for us, and also how we relate to the international legal order. It is this view of international law anchored in state centrism is important because it speaks about the evolution of the international system from a moment in which was characterized by imperial center-periphery relations, but that, however, was reversed, first of all, with the wave of independence in the Americas at the beginning of the 19th century, and then consolidated in the expansion of the decolonization project after the Second World War between the 1950s to the mid-1970s. International law celebrates this, and as a result of that, organizes itself in terms of the protection of the nation state as the main category of the international legal order. As a result of that, for international lawyers, there's a clear distinction between the international and the national, which has an effect, a very important effect, in terms of the separation between the past and the present. The past was imperial, the present is national. Has a very important impact on how we understand the geography of the problems that are concern us. The international law is a field of law that is concerned about global affairs, when domestic legal orders are concerned with domestic, closer problems to peoples on the ground, which means that for international law, there's a clear division between what is near and what is far. And finally, and this is perhaps a more abstract point, there's, as a result of this state centrism and its impact on all of these binary ways of understanding the world, there's an impact in terms of what is the concern of law and what is life, what it is not necessarily the direct preoccupation of international lawyers. This state-centrism, of course, has enormous effects in terms of how we understand the geopolitical forces of the world. For international lawyers that follow this tradition, for the ideas, for example, of the world divided between the global north and the global south, which is what consensus here about, are really not relevant. What it is important is about protecting the states as that center pieces of the international legal, political, economic system. Now, the issues with these are enormous, and I'm sure my co-panelists will explore them in many of these issues in many great detail in the interventions. For international lawyers, this has been a concern because as the decolonization project of the Second World War was consolidating, a series of challenges started to become very clear. One of the challenges was that even though formal sovereign independence had been acquired initially in the New World and then in the rest of the colonial world in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, there was still international forces challenging constantly that sovereignty. In terms of the old colonial powers still advancing claims against these now independent nationalist states, and then the expansion of actors that not pay respect to these newly acquired independence and rights of self-determination. Now, sometimes this penetration of the sovereign veil was taking place explicitly by corporations, that it was something, a concern that underpinned many of the conversations and that took place amongst international lawyers and newly third world elites in the 1950s and 1960s by multinational corporations, but also by a set of desires that now we have come to understand as Eurocentric desires that were rapidly expanding across the world, making citizens on the ground of these newly independent states anchoring these desires on goods and services that were not produced in the lands, therefore basically forcing states and actors on the ground to allow the circulation of goods and services that put into question the ability of these countries to survive only with the goods and services produced at home. These conversations that I just rapidly mentioned here took a clear form in claims advanced during the 1950s and 1960s in terms of the newly colonial character of the world. Even this process of decolonization was taking place. So the point was made by Nkrumah, for example, that we had definitely left colonialism behind, but it was only formal colonialism. Colonialism was still around in the form of neo-colonialism. This obviously was one of the first official challenges to this world of this international world that was inaugurated after the Second World War, and the idea that the primary unit to understand world relations was the national states. These initial concerns with the neo-colonial character of the international legal order was picked up by a series of meetings and that were organized in the second half of the 20th century, which in more or less extent put into question the neutrality of the new world order organized around national states. So the first of these meetings that put into question this new world order was the Bandung Conference that took place in Indonesia in 1955, the first not white international conference organized by leaders of Africa and Asia. Which was then some of the Bandung spirit and the lessons learned in that conference were expanded, and then came to underpin the formation of the non-aligned movement in 1961, which was then took a more radical form in the Tricontinental Conference that took place in La Habana in Cuba in 1966. And that by the end of the 1960s have already come to form an alternative bloc of states that now we know as the G77, which was formed in 1967. And these conferences, the Bandung Conference, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the Non-Aligned Movement was born on a Belgrade Conference, and the Tricontinental Conference all speak about increasing concerns with this idea of having an international order that was functional thanks to the recognition of former sovereignty. In all of these conferences, the sense was that that was not enough to describe the new geography of the world. Something else was around. These three conferences, the Bandung Conference, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the Tricontinental Conference, produce a series of claims. The most important of them, the claim that a new international economic order was needed, which was a banner that mobilized many of these states now identified with the G77 movement in the NEIO, the New International Economic Order declaration that was passed by the General Assembly in 1975. Basically, the point of the new international economic order was this: that the world as a smooth place being formed by nation state was not giving us a proper sense of who was winning and who was losing, and former sovereignty was not necessarily the best vehicle to address long-standing concerns with the functioning of the global order. Colonialism was still around, not necessarily in a formal manner, but through informal, indirect mechanisms. This is why by the 1960s, by the 1970s, for sure, it was clear that a new geography had to be advanced in order to interpret, to express, to articulate the concerns of the asymmetries of power across the world. There's the context where international lawyers and in particular intellectuals and political leaders start talking about the third world. Okay, there's a third group of countries that were not aligned with the USSR or the United States. They were not aligned politically, but also they were not in equal terms when we think about economic gain and losses at the international level. By the 1980, Willy Brandt, in the report that we now know as the Brandt Report, talk about then of the existence of the emergence of a developed world different from a developing world. Now, by the 1970s and 1980s, this was already a much more, was understood as much more powerful, much more accurate way of thinking about the world organization, and international law started to reflect that. One clear example of this situation was the prominent role of G77, or that the G77 started to have in international conversations. Now, what the next chapter of the story is a much more complex one. As we know, during the 1980s and the 1990s, the world economy went through a massive transformation that we now know as the emergence of a new international division of labor, the shifting of industrial production from the developed world to the developing world, all of that with the help of an increasing number of international trade agreements, producing what today is identified as the spaghetti ball, an image that the UNCTAD had been circulating for many years. Here, one example of that. Now, this new international division of labor and the shifting of industrial power to the developing world, however, has not meant that wealth has shifted or follow that new location of industrial power. It has definitely happened. Industrial production has shifted to the developing world, but that has not necessarily shifted wealth, okay, and in particular wealth accumulation. One of example of that, there are many examples that we can mobilize here. One interesting is how this reorganization of the international economic order had not meant that wealth is being distributed across the world in equal terms. Rather than that, what we have seen is increasing levels of inequality that is even more pronounced in the developing world. So, which means that the industrial power has arrived to the developing world only to enrich a very small subsections of the developing world population. This is why over the last recent years, we have seen a shifting away from the use of the international as an accurate way of describing the world order. And we are seeing more use of the global as a concept, or more importantly, the global south as a concept. A clear expression of these concerns about the shifting dynamics of the international economic order and its way of knowing, its inability to reverse long trends in the maldistribution of resources across the world happens today in conversations about the global value chains. In this context, it is the official idea is that in this world of national states, each unit benefits because each unit can participate in which each unit is good about. So we have a clean surface and smooth representations of the world. However, when we go and see internally what's happening in terms of distribution of resources and wealth across global value chains, the usual suspects ended up winning again and again in terms of national states or particular multinationals. I mean, this is not a dark story or not a secret story. Now, a further complication of these recent decades of the transformation of the international economic order and its impact on the international legal and political order is that we are all complicit in it. Okay, we all are feeding now a machinery that has a much more global character, where asymmetries are now expanding as we participate in it. This is why conversations that first initiated in terms of international debates have mutated to conversations about the global order. And now perhaps people are saying, well, we need to think about the global south and more importantly, about most of the world who ended up not benefiting from these transformations. I'm just gonna finish now. Yesterday, Jason Hickel said, however, that even though we are all complicit in this complex world that I just described here very quickly, the global north and south divide continue to be important. So as industrialized versus not industrialized countries, but the south is home to 85% of the world industrial workforce. It is just that they receive almost none of the value they produce. This is why this is a graph coming from Jason Hickel's work. Even though we live in a world that is much more dynamic, we still see an increasing divergence in terms of GDP per capita when we compare the global north and the global south. And we're seeing also a world that is increasingly more in hardcore terms divided between the old-fashioned colonial powers and colonized territories. There are many examples here that we could mention, but I think this graph speaks for itself. Is the world graph circulated a few years ago, and it shows how all colonial powers or territories closely associated to all colonial powers have cordoned off themselves and now kind of systematically excluding with what we could call the global south. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. We now welcome Vinod Ramanarayanan. Thank you once again, Vinod, for talking to us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And yeah, I'm going to share my screen now. Just to make sure, is my screen visible?
Yes, we can see it.
Wonderful. Great. So myself, I work with the Humboldt Foundation. I work from the urban sustainability point of view, and I've worked a lot on the urban resources that are available to people and how different cities have managed. So most of my work in the last 5 years has been on implementation and impact measurement. And one of the things that I'm working on as part of my fellowship itself is in the Humboldt Foundation is to understand, do we really understand the problems of Global South from the context of Global South and from the local context? I grew up in India. I did my master's in Singapore, and now I'm in Germany. So I've kind of first-hand experience. I've seen how things grow from a person who's living, and not just as a researcher. So this is what I'm trying to bring in this next 10 minutes today, and hope we have a good time and an interesting discussion after this. Yeah. So it's not a hidden fact that a lot of urban theories are predominantly based on Western perspectives, the so-called global perspective. From Lewis's final graph, we can say the 73% of the income and 14% of the population. Most of the urban theories come from there. And that's because the research is either funded through here or research itself is driven from a Western perspective. And for example, a lot of ideas of big data and computer models and interaction and human activity of biophysical process are looked at as something that's acts as a catalyst to take things forward in terms of urban development. But even taking the case of, okay, I'm going to share an example here. Yeah, I worked in Singapore, and the lab that I worked in Singapore was from Prime Minister's office. So in that Prime Minister's office, the problem that we were looking at is to map approximate activity patterns of people so that the emissions and energy consumption in terms of your everyday commute and the place where you eat and the house and the energy that you consume in terms of electricity and fuel, that can be reduced, and as a society, Singapore can go towards a greener economy, right? So here, there was definitely a lot of talk about big data, human activity, and biophysical process in this whole scenario. And my next role, I worked with the smart city in India, which is my home country. And there, the availability of data and the access to data by itself is a question, and how fast it can be done, it's also a question. And measuring an urban success based on the measuring India's success based on Singapore definitely is a bad idea, and that's something that I'm trying to push for. And maybe the new urban agenda will include what is in the South, not just understanding the difference between the North and the South, but even within the South, Global South, there's a lot of differences. So I think this table is a very good example of that. As we can see, the papers on global or global North, average authorship from North is 94%. But the papers on global South, the first author from South being is just 3%. So even from an academical point of view, I'm looking at this point. So the first author from the South percentage is like 3%. So even from the academical point of view, a push for this is something that's necessary and something that needs to move towards in terms of building the agenda of the new urban agenda, and also building urban theory from the Global South perspective. So this, I thought, was a very interesting piece. And China emerging as a superpower, they've also built their own authorship and their own problems. They've made it like their research, it has come out in the world, and that has also helped them to grow not only the economic activities, but also everything that supports them. So how Global South agenda can be different. So that's the next question. We understand that it is different, but what are the advantages that the Global South can take? And what are the things that Global South can do so that the agenda there is different? First, in Global South, fortunately and unfortunately, the lack of financial capacity is stopping a lot of things to move forward, but that can also bring in some radically disruptive, affordable solutions. So in all the three examples, I'm going to talk about one of the projects that I worked on, and happy to answer more questions. So, for example, it's not a hidden fact that New Delhi is kind of the face for air pollution and how air pollution can be monitored. And me, along with another organization based out of Delhi, we worked on a very quick air pollution monitoring system in New Delhi. So the tuk-tuks that are there in India, an air pollution monitor was fixed on top of the tuk-tuks, and this was a moving air pollution monitor that went to the different parts of the city on a random basis because it's driven by consumers where the vehicle wants to travel. And from there, because of the random movement, the number of data and it was procured from the sensor that was placed on top of the tuk-tuks, or what we call in India the autos, we collected the air pollution data. Of course, it is not as accurate as an industry level or air pollution data, but the difference in terms of the number of data points, the difference can be definitely overlooked. So, and this was not a very expensive process that needed a bureaucracy. It can be something that can be like a college pet project for an undergraduation student. It can be very simple like that. So even though there is a lack of financial capacity, there was radical disruption that went into build affordable solutions to monitor the air pollution, which was a huge problem in New Delhi. And the next one is inadequate urban infrastructure is again not a hidden thing. In Global South, I'm again building a fact from my case study in my home city, Chennai. So because of lack of basic infrastructure, I mean, there's acknowledgement that there's lack of basic infrastructure, but there is also a lot of citizen and participation movement that can be taken advantage of. So not everything needs to be top down, bottom up is also definitely something that's possible. So I worked on a project with the Public Works Department of Government of Tamil Nadu in Chennai after the floods in 2015. And this was used to monitor, this was a mobile app that was created and made public. Citizens just used that to map encroachments and places where they had flood blockages. And that went in as a report to the Public Works Department, and the implementation and execution started immediately. And because of the population and density, that can also be taken advantage of. And this is something that I see a lot of similar examples in Mexico, in Africa, in South Africa, Ghana, from my friends. But this is a case where I've seen a lot of these cases spurting more from the Global South than from the Global North. And third, there are definitely shortcomings in governance systems. Touching upon some of the things that Louis said, historically, the governance system of the Global South was completely different before and probably during colonization. And what we are looking at right now is kind of a governance system that's similar to colonization, but still not there. But even to take advantage of those systems, there can be informal and formal institutions set up to drive innovations. So this is a project that inspires me always. This is not something that I've worked on, but this is a project that inspires me. This is called the shit flow diagram. The water and sanitation is a huge problem in India, and this is a tool that is very focused to the India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka context, and it has high impact. And to do something like this as parallel to the governance system is something that's, again, I've seen a lot of this happen in Global South, and I think this is how in terms of pushing the global agenda, global South can be different. And the next question that I'm trying to bring about for our discussion here is the North ready to learn from South? So it's a usual perception that there is a lot for the southern countries, southern nations to learn from the North, but do we really have the same for the North to also learn from the South? So here we are looking at two graphs. This is a water governance capacity tool, which I've also played a role and also adapting for my fellowship. And the one is the Amsterdam and other one is Quinto in Ecuador. And if you can see, even though the case is very different, the top three of low of Amsterdam, the local sense of urgency, Quinto is doing really well. And consumer willingness to pay compared to Amsterdam, Quinto is doing really well. So we're talking about GDP per capita, but the willingness to pay for an urban resource is very high in Quinto than in Amsterdam. And the ambitious and realistic goals, setting of those realistic goals is also something that's like super native for Quinto is doing far better than in Amsterdam. And this is water. So in terms of water, both Amsterdam and Quinto are facing scarcity, and they're looking at it as an urban issue. But for Amsterdam to work better, can they learn, or are they willing to learn from Global South is another question that I want to bring to our forum for today's discussion. And last but not the least, a lot of these things, a lot of the points that we've discussed so far can be built based on contextualization. And contextualization needs to be better understood. Even for the previous graph, the willingness pay, all of these can be argued in a very different level from the contextualization. But to differentiate the global South urban agenda and the global North urban agenda, I think contextualization is something that's a predicament that's very important to bring in. And this is the framework for my research as part of the fellowship that I'm working on right now. And the question and the idea is contextualization of urban issues to zoom in better and focus more on the global South agenda. And that's my time, and happy to discuss more on this now. Thanks.
Thank you, Vinod. Thank you so much. We just saw Professor Luciana Balestrin was with us a minute ago, but I can't seem to find her. In case she's got connection problems right now, but I just saw her quickly and she's not here on the list anymore. But in any case, if she's not here right now, we can maybe start with some questions we have received already. And before we move over to the one question that I see on the chat, I would like to make a question about the current situation concerning COVID, but I think that we can leave for a later moment. I just want to make a very broad question here. I was talking to Artur one of these days. He's also in the organizing committee. So I would like to hear from both of you, if possible, how this term is used and how global South, right? And how it can be understood when we talk about climate change. So the global South as an actor, or the global South as a subject that is affected by the discussion of climate change? Can we think about global South as an actor or as an entity that does set the agenda for climate change discussions? How do you see that? I would like to start with Luis. So how do you see the discussion of climate change when we're talking about the global South? Is it an actor? Is it possible to think it as a unified actor? I know this is a very vague question, but I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Flavio. So I think I would like to start answering that by kind of bringing an attention to the fact that global South is both things. It has two characters. One is there's an empirical character to the idea of the global South that is an uncomfortable empirical fact. And I was trying to suggest that in my presentation, that even though we lived, it seems, in a world that is very different from the old colonial world, there is still a structural bias towards places that once upon a time were colonial enclaves. And regardless of very important, significant legal political transformations, we haven't been able to leave that past behind fully. So our current predicament is that we live in terms of form, in a different world, but in terms of substance, a world that continues to resemble uncannily that past. That's first thing. Now, the other function of the idea of the global South, it is that it is a political claim that necessarily matches perfectly with empirical facts, which means that there's an enormous amount of nuances that needs to be put, and a small fact and exception that needs to be accepted when we have conversations about the global South. That's the first part of my answer. The second part, in terms of the climate change makes this very real. So the huge problem of the climate change is that it's a global phenomenon, is affecting everyone, regardless of how much or how little we have contributed to it. This is why part of the energies in the legal world about climate change has been how we come up with legal formulas to help us to redistribute better blames and gains and progress in these areas. So the whole idea of common but differentiated obligations is tries to capture that, okay? What it tries to do in the context of conversation about the global North and the global South is to accept that the global North is the global North and has got to that point thanks to, well, the exploitation, the systematic exploitation of natural resources, but that exploitation of natural resources is not an exclusive responsibility, or it is an exclusive fact of global North peoples, but there's certain peoples in the global North and definitely certain people also in the global South that have contributed more than others to the problem of climate change. So what I find, and this is my final third step in my answer, what it is useful to remember in these conversations when the climate change is on the table and global North, global South is on the table, then when we say global South, we are what are doing is to making an empirical point as well as a political point, which should take us to reorganize our sensibilities towards solutions that are able to capture all structural asymmetries at the same time as accepting that those all structural symmetries are not only the singular primary benchmark in which we should assess things. So South-oriented scholars in that way can be both from the global North and the global South. And what characterizes them is, again, a sense of empiricism about things are asymmetrical and they follow all patterns, as well as an orientation towards the kinds of solutions that we want to see put in place.
Okay, thank you very much, Luis. And I would like to apologize to every attendee here. I was not seeing Professor Bellestrin, but she was here already. It was a problem with my Zoom account. So, Vinod, I would like to hear your thoughts on that afterwards. Okay, so we're going to go back to that topic that I just asked Luis, but I think we should just move over. And Professor Luciana Bellestrin, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yes. Thank you, Flavio. I'm here.
I don't
know why my cam doesn't work. Ok. Que a
No
questão é que você ligar e desligar. Deixa eu tentar de novo, então.
All right, no problem.
Ok.
Okay. Professor Bellestrin just said she will reconnect to see if her camera works. So we can just wait for 20 seconds here. Let's see if it works now.
I don't know what happened.
Oh, it's a
Because
shame.
my
But we can still hear
is
you.
okay.
Yeah, we can still hear you. No problem. You have a presentation you would like to share with us?
Yes, but I think it's complicated to stay in this way. Do
I
you?
I have your presentation with me. I can.
Ok. Mas, Flávio, aqui está dizendo que é o host que não está deixando eu entrar, tu entende?
Okay, let me check that.
A minha câmera tá ok, tá tudo ok.
Just a second.
On our side, so the host is talking here. On our side, it seems that everything's also okay. So I gave you all the rights.
Okay.
All rights.
Oh, there you are.
Now,
There you
right.
are.
Okay,
Now we can see
thank you. Okay, thank you.
Let me just make you one last question, Luciana. Do you want to present the PowerPoint yourself, or do you want me to do that?
I think pode ser tu, Flávio, pode ser tu, que eu acho que fica mais. São poucos slides, a few slides for us.
Ok, já vou abrir aqui.
Thank you. Sorry.
That's all right. So you have the floor, Luciana.
Okay. Let's. I need to see my presentation here. Sorry. Preciso. One moment, Flávio. Eu preciso minimizar aqui para olhar minha apresentação.
Não tem problema. Eu tô projetando aqui, tá? O pessoal já tá vendo.
Agora deu. Ok. Ok. Sorry. Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for the invitation and to congratulate to the organizers of this webinar. Thank you very much, Flávio, Arthur, Natalia. It's a pleasure, Vinod, Corina, and other participants, Luis. I am very happy to be here with you. My presentation is based on my little text called Global South as Political Project, which was published in an academic site, and it is available to anyone. When Arthur invited me for today's discussion, he didn't know about this such text. So it was a truly coincidence that I had wrote a text about similar points as proposed by this seminar. Okay. We can start thinking on Global South as a central category to the post-colonial, to the post-colonialism in 21st century. If we agree with this affirmation, we can propose the understanding of Global South as political project in a larger imagery of global conflicts. There are at least 4 dimensions regarding Global South idea. One, the descriptive, one, identitarian, other analytical, and epistemological one. I will talk a little of each one to develop my argument. So, of course, they are crossing each other all the time. It's the structure of my presentation. The next slide, please, Flávio. Okay. So the descriptive or academic sense refers to the technical and neutral attempt use of the term. That is a geographical or territorial use. As the idea of Global South appeared in international vocabulary and its institutions, Global South became a key concept for the South-South comparations programs. It is the Global South of international relations as discipline and practice. The reference is to the report entitled North-South, a Program for Survival, written by Independent Commission on International Development Issues, constituted in 1977 and chaired by Willy Brandt. Arthur, please, can you put the next slide? Okay. So this line divides between two parts, the world in developed and developing countries. And it's the first time that vocabulary appeared in the international lexicon. The association of the South with the predicate global happened due to the end of the Cold War and the globalization discourse and dynamics. Because of the reference regarding poor and developing countries, in contrast to the richest and developed ones, the Global South is the heir of the outdated Third World concept. The Third World concept tradition is associated with the leftist agenda in the search for autonomy, independence, and self-determination. The concept was coined in 1952, alluding to a part of the world which was not identified with the capitalist, neither communist proposition towards modernity, despite the influence of the socialist bloc on different liberation movements. In both denominations, Global South or Third World, the classification of the world considers the stage of economic development towards modernity as the main parameter. The understanding of such modernity and development is strongly associated with the idea of progress or evolution. However, as well as the idea of the Third World, the Global South cannot be simply as a set of non-developed and non-modern countries localized in the ex-colonial zones of the globe. There are many different meanings for both categories, which should not be understood exclusively in a geographical or territorial sense. The two terms were capable of projecting a subaltern geopolitical identity, presenting different ways to belonging in the international system. It is what I called here as an identitarian dimension. So here, a political imagery and a geopolitical identity shares the colonial past. Before the term South appeared in the international vocabulary in the 80s, it had already been used in different situations to describe a marginalized position. In 1943, the illustration of the inverted South America map made by the Uruguayan artist Joaquim Torres Garcia represented the rethinking of such subalternity position. He proposed the idea, our North is the South. Please, Arthur, the next slide. Okay. Both illustrations from Joaquim Torres Garcia. The design is called Inverted America. In the identitarian view, the Global South works more than the absence of underdevelopment metaphor. The 20th century anti-colonial movement, the Bandung Conference, the No-Aligned movement, and Cuba tricontinentalism are some examples at which the Global South has its origins and influences. For this, the concept can work, as put by Siba Gorvogi, as a symbolic designation that emerged when the former colonial entities engaged in political projects of decolonization and moved towards the realization of a post-colonial international order. Thus, the term alludes to the history of imperialism and colonialism, as well as to the violence suffered by its different members. It is a nation-state identity, above all. A third dimension or sense or use is the academic or analytical dimension. that requires to transform the concept in more operational and complex terms. The members of the Global South are not necessarily nation states, and they can be defined in transnational social terms, or even a set of practices, attitudes, and relations. Such understandings about what is the Global South allows us thinking of it as a category without a central command, defined scale, or exclusive form. Therefore, it's important to recognize the great variety of actors, discourses, institutions, and movements that take part in this category. The Global South is not a monolithic, cohesive, coherent, and homogeneous entity characterized by the absence of conflicts and interests. For both analytical and political purposes, it is important not to simplify or romanticize the idea of the Global South. The existence of the South in the North and the North in the South complexifies the reproduction of new colonial and new imperial power, especially in the current context of increasing global inequalities. I think it's very interesting to think in terms of coloniality and imperiality. So the rejection of everything regarding the global North, it can self a dangerous position, and its complexity needs to be taken into consideration also. The simplification, reduction, and essentialization elapse from the mobilization from binary categories, such as center, periphery, west and east, first or third world. Politically, the self-recognition of one's own subaltern position can be operated as strategic essentialism, as put by Spivak, in Spivak terms. Thus, the Global South imagery is identified with the history of the peripheries, the East as a rest, and the third world. The reaffirmation of subalternity does not allow forgetting the colonial difference until the present. So it is possible to verify a subaltern position regarding the international system, the economic dynamics, the cultural expressions, the academic structures, the thinking systems. The Eurocentric character of modern imperial power created resistance against Western domination. So the last one, sense or dimension, is to an epistemological sense that has been constructing in the last 2 decades. Such understanding refers on the Global South as valid and original producer of knowledge. The Southern theories and epistemologies research agenda have gathered debates about academic dependence, the geopolitics of knowledge, and other logic of knowing. This research agenda had its origins in the previous discussion about third world sociology, dependence theory, liberation philosophy, post-colonial feminism, and many others. So the potential of the idea of Global South. We know that the beginning of the 21st century, the Global South was the most powerful force to present and claim future alternatives to neoliberal globalization, as well as the continuity of struggles on the colonization. From the civil society's perspective, several examples can be remembered. Another globalization is possible was the slogan of the World Social Forum. The struggles against racism have reverberated in different institutions. The environment and indigenous peoples' right protection became part of the international agenda. Experiences of decolonization have promoted the new Latin America constitutionalism, and finally, other kinds of contestation around the world, such as demands on decolonizing academic curriculum or historical monuments and museums. From a governmental and intergovernmental point of view, the first decade of the 21st century has witnessed the emergence of powers like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa that together formed the BRICS. In the Latin America context, the region had experienced the so-called left turn or pink tide following the democratic elections of leftists leaderships in different countries. So there are limits. In a larger context, South-South cooperation was stimulated within the new paradigm of development proposed by the United Nations Development Programme, Forging a Global South, published in 2003. According to Grew and Gills, South-South cooperation has been a key organizing concept and a set of practices in pursuit of these historical changes through a vision of mutual benefit and solidarity among the disadvantaged of the world system. But the limit of this new arrangement are very clear, as put by Arif Dirlik. The Global South, or the South, had to seek development in the global capitalist economy. So, because of constraints and reinforcement of the global neoliberal agenda, the South-South cooperation has a limited potential to delinking or decolonizing the post-colonial international order. This is very different from the revolutionary role performed by the Third World in making a decolonial inflection in the bipolar Cold War dynamics. The solution to the South problems must be part of global solutions, as Dirlik pointed. So the absence of alternatives outside the market-oriented competition and the neoliberal ideology and the rationality offers reduced possibilities to construct new paths to development, to question what kind of the development or even why development. Furthermore, the different structural constraints of the post-colonial international order included the state-centered form, raise suspicion to more critical or radical voices, which are seeing the Global South as a product made by Global North. So, challenges of this idea or project. The Global South is a political project permanently disputed by progressive and regressive forces in the multipolar context. Nowadays, the Global South has several challenges to maintain itself as an important political project towards a fairer and equal world. The pandemic, the decrease of democratic regimes, and the consequences of the Anthropocene are radically modifying the current global context. The reconstruction of the idea of humankind, the continuity of the decolonization projects, and the retrieval of democracy and the rescue of politics from the neoliberal rationality will be urgent texts of the Global South, along with the South of the Global North. We need to think deeply the meanings of decolonization in the 21st century, and if Global South still have force, and what is your role now in such projects. In the same way, I have argued in the last years about the importance of democracy in the post-colonial agenda, in the renew post-colonial agenda. I am speaking from Brazil, where just yesterday died almost 3,800 persons just in one day. The epidemic in Brazil is a humanitarian catastrophe. So the necropolitics carried by Bolsonaro's government is only possible because their government disrespect and destroyed our democracy every day. Thank you very much. And sorry for my fast talk. Is this? The next slide is my reference. Arthur, please. Can you put just to show the public my texts?
Okay, thank you very much, Luciana. Thank you for the very thought-provoking presentation. And one coincidence after another. This is the, I don't know if you guys can see my t-shirt. I have a Torres Garcia t-shirt. This is the artist that Luciana was mentioning now. That inverts the global south and put it in the north. So a great artist from Latin America. We have so many questions coming in. Before going to those questions, however, because the presentations have been so interesting, I would like to just ask our presenters, our panelists, to have a very short, make a very short notes on what they've heard from other presenters, or something they feel that still needs to be spoken that they didn't have time to, but especially if they could have a dialogue with what has been presented by the fellow panelists. So 2 minutes, maybe maximum 3. I don't know if there's anything else you would like to bring to the table concerning what the other panelists have mentioned. Luis, we can start with you.
Thank you, Flavio. Thanks, Luciana, for a wonderful intervention. I just want to say a couple of things about Luciana's and Vinod's talks, which I feel resonate with the way I understand also the Global South, and I use it in my own work. Luciana was making the very important point here about the Global South being a category without actual command. And I think that's extremely important. It can be extremely irritated though. People and critical critiques of the Global South as a category start from there. It is too broad. It is not accurate enough. It is too erratic. People use it for all sorts of political agendas, so on and so forth. And I think everyone will be sympathetic to some, at least with some strands of those critiques, and will be perhaps annoyed in the same way with some because of as a result of some of those critiques. But Luciana also made a very valid point, and I think explains that lack of command behind the Global South, because there needs to be some strategic essentialism in place when we're dealing with phenomena that have been produced as a result of centuries of global history, and not necessarily match the categories and the institutions and the structures that we have superimposed on the planet. So here I'm thinking about the national state. So one of the strategies, epistemic strategies of the national state is to stabilize the world order, to assume that if we divide the planet in 190 plus states, things are going to be better, and that's going to be achieved by assigning to each of these 190 plus units the same rights and the same responsibilities. But let me tell you, it hasn't worked out. It hasn't worked so much that we still, as I was trying to, one of the points I tried to make in my talk is that we have pretty much the same resilient levels of maldistribution of resources of a few centuries ago, even though we have got an entire machinery to support this superimposed structure on the world. And on the top of that, we also know that states themselves and the elites that attach themselves to states contribute to that maldistribution of resources. So once again, instability of the Global South is just not simply the result of radical intellectuals from the South trying to create a category that no one understands. It is actually a very powerful intervention that tries to speak of a world that is in constant convulsion. So in order to do that, you have to advance an idea that yes, is broad and it is elusive at some point, but creates some essentialisms that are important in order to start getting a handle on this mess. This first thing. Now, Vinod's made a very important practical contribution to the conversation by pinpointing what happens if you give a chance to the South to speak. So what happens once you accept that the South, even though all of its problems, is a place that has a different alternative way of understanding things and also come up with its own solutions. This is not a question, of course, about the Global South speaking the truth. It is not about the Global South being a better way 100% to get a handle on the situation, but at least it gives the possibility of having other sets of actors, other sets of voices, other sets of solutions to be considered. Mm-hmm. Surprise, surprise, some of that, when you let that happens, you know, some actual progress starts being seen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Luis. Vinod, your 2 cents?
Yes, thanks, Flavio. And yeah, I mean, I think I couldn't have put it better than what Luis just put as a summary from Professor Luciana and his own presentation. But all this conversation reminds me of one question that very often comes up during my time in Singapore. So one question that always comes is like, Singapore started developing in the middle of 1960s, and it has developed so far, and it was able to do that. And is it because of the geographical size? Is it because of the placement? All these questions come up. And because of a lot of Indians in Singapore, and also because of the neighboring countries and neighboring superpower, India comes into question, can India develop like Singapore? But I think one of the things that's often missed in the whole discussion is Singapore was able to align itself quickly to the global north definitions. And for India or for other countries, they had to define their own terms. So the whole measurement of success was completely different. And I think our conversation really opens up to that, and how even though in the middle of a small dot in the middle of Asia, Singapore is kind of a global north place, but all the others are, because they've aligned to the global north definitions and the so-called global south hasn't. So that's something that I want to touch on, which kind of which is a memory that I'm filled with, and that was instigated from Professor Luciana and Dr. Luis. Thanks. Thanks, Flavio.
Thank you, Vinod. And Luciana, if you have in 3 minutes something to add to what Luis and Vinod have just said. We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. I'm sorry again because I arrived late and I didn't. I couldn't listen the presentation, entire presentation of my colleagues table. So I think it's interesting to think Global South as an identitarian or a potential imaginary that works to several categories, such as social movements, cultural designs, civil society perspectives, more than the nation state identity. Because the great point is the central point is the nation state as the main territory, and this constraint of the international order, a system with 195 nation states. So I think it's important to bring to us the economic and cultural epistemological terms also, to think in a broader way, the Global South. And we need to think in a practical terms also. For example, Brazil in the last decade was an important leadership in the global South, in South-South programs. So of course, it's limited. It's limited to transform the structural order, but it's important in several areas, such the fight against Hungary, or improve the wealth programs and so on. This is a practice important. A power practice that important also. I think that we don't forget this. But nowadays, the idea of global South, I think it's very it's not have so much force than had in the past, and this occurred because we are now living a global crisis of liberal democracies, very complicated, that show us a very regressive forces and dispositions to destroy our rights, minimal civil or social and political rights. So I think it's important to think global South in this actual context, in the actual context to reconstruct, to recover an order more democratic and more democratic and associated with a kind of a reconstruction of humankind that associated also the protection, for example, of the nature and environment. So I think it's important to reconstruct these great agendas and great ideas, and the global South is important to do this.
Thank you, Luciana. As disclaimer, Professor Balestrin, Luciana, she said she was late, but she was late because of me. I forgot that the summertime has started in Germany, so I gave her the Brazilian time from last week. So that was why we didn't have the right time. So I apologize for that. In any case, our the presentations here will be recorded so everybody can follow them afterwards. We have many questions now coming in, so I'm going to make blocks of questions if it's okay with the panelists. We can start with 3 now and then 3 afterwards. We still have 15-20 minutes until the end of our event. So we have the first question from Gabriela Silva. She asks, considering the pandemic and the economic consequences and the changes that are happening and are about to happen, is there a possibility for the Global South to overcome this, or is this just going to increase world inequality? This is the first question by Gabriela Silva. Second question by Alexandra Tost. It's a very provocative question. Do you think the term Global South is the best existing? Are there alternative terms? How about low-income countries? Can the heterogeneity among and inside these countries be represented by this? Yes, this was Alexandra's question. And finally, Ingeborg Nistroy has asked, what about the 2030 agenda or the Sustainable Development Goals? A universal agenda, but to be translated in the individual countries. In my view, it's been a process that has underlined the importance of contextualization. What do you think? This was Dr. Nistroy's question. So I think we can start with these 3. So I would ask maybe each panelist to spend 3 minutes commenting on one, or as many questions as they want, but 3 minutes so we can contemplate as many questions as possible. And we start with Luciana now. If you can unmute yourself, Luciana.
Sorry again. Okay. I will comment the Gabriela question. Okay. And maybe the comment made by Natalia in the chat about the map. Okay. Gabriela, I think it's very important, your question, because as Professor Luis talk about the idea of absence of command. And it is important to think in terms of political project and its leadership or representatives. So I think it's important to como é que a gente diz confirma, to form a commitment regarding the representation of Global South in different institutions. So it's the first point, because it cannot be just an idea, a ghost idea. So we need to material or an empirical support of the idea of Global South. And the question of put by Natalia, it's very interesting, because in Brazil we have different regions, and como é que fala Nordeste, Flávio? And
Northeast.
When we inverted the map of South America, the Northeast became the South again. So my colleagues yesterday told with me about this. So it's important we don't buy the trap of inversion things. The global North as put by a cohesive block. Without differences or hierarchies or domination or inequalities within. So it's important to complexify how the new forms of imperialism and colonialism operates now. I think it's a very important challenge, analytical challenge. So I like to think in terms of imperiality as the logic of coloniality, to think different actors of global governance that private the political power, privatizate the political power. So,
thank you, Luciana. Vinod?
Yes, thanks, Flavio. Yeah, so I would like to quickly touch on the 2020 agenda question. I think it's a great question, and my answer is going to be, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to keep my answer very straightforward and simple here. And I think the 2020 agenda and the SDG goals are very relevant, but they are, the contextualization depends on a very at a very local level. So the agenda itself, I think, doesn't, I mean, even though it encourages contextualization, the broad goals and the broad ideas capture. And when the SDG rankings of cities are given, it doesn't talk about contextualization, but the implementation or the mitigation from the SDG goals, that when that is taken and made to a local level, that's when these contextualization becomes important. So that's how I see the 2020 agenda. And I mean, I'm sure the other two panelists are much well versed than me in terms of answering on the Global South, the term question. But what I would like to quickly touch on is I think the idea of Global South was formed after the colonization, after the after finding of, like, from the Europe, from the explorers, that there is a southern world that is there. Historically, that's how things started. And the colonization, they already had a definition, and trying to fit the global south to that definition was how things, the global south term was coined. So yeah, but even though there are a lot of steps taken to break this, in terms of economy, in terms of GDP, like the BRICS Association or the ASEAN Association, though there are steps, still because of the economical superpowers in terms of Tokyo, Frankfurt, New York, and exchange in all these places, they still kind of become the global power for economics and finances. So yeah, that's something that I wanted to touch on. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinod. Luis?
Thank you. I just want to say a couple of things about Alexandra's question, and then I see if I can say something about Ingeborg and Gabriel's questions too. So the Alexandra's question is about the global south and whether there are other concepts that will do more work in the world. And definitely, I think we should not confine ourselves to one single way of thinking about the world order, and low income has a role to play in conversations about, for example, economic policies and development policies, international trade, international aid, so on and so forth. And so I wouldn't comment on the low income per se and the history of it and on how much we can achieve by it. My point there is that we should have and allow more concepts to emerge. In defense of the global south, however, what I will say is that it does a huge amount of work, as Luciana was mentioning and Vinod was inviting us to consider, because of the way it invites us to change a traditional orientation towards the world and how we can get to a better place. How we can approach history by shifting registers, by shifting our horizons. And I think that's very, very important. Also, it is important because, as the term immediately suggests, is not state-centric. And this is what I was trying to invite us to think about here. So it is a concept that unplugs itself from the sophism of a state as being the primary unit to consider world relations and global history. In that sense, is good. Now, the problem with the global south is that it is still borrows too much from geography, okay? So it is still about where people are emplotted at a particular point in time according to this world history. So even though it takes us away from, or it makes a huge progress when you compare to the brands developing topography or cartography of the world rather, or it takes us away from the Cold War third world language, it still assumes that the way in which our past, present, and future is defined is because the place we are at a particular moment. And I think there's definitely something to say about that. But because what we're witnessing now is a new international division of labor, the emergence, we're living today in the world of the 1%. We live today in the world in what most of global wealth is producing through the mechanisms of speculation and financial, in particular, financial speculations. There has been, and we live in a moment of late capitalist development. There has been such a detachment of questions of wealth production and accumulations from geographical location that the global south find difficult to describe reality. So this is why I feel, for example, that the idea of Partha Chatterjee's idea of most of the world is a really powerful one, because it basically helps us to get a sense of the intense volatility of the present, while at the same time paying attention to maldistribution of resources that now, once again, do not happen along geographical lines. It happens along sequence of accumulation that are not necessarily linear. now, just to conclude there, this idea of that we're living through a new, perhaps new international division of labor is really important, because that sense of what we're here talking about is just not simply politics. We're talking here about the effective maldistribution of resources, and the efforts in these conversations and conversations that happen in many other places today to create categories that are able to grasp a world that is way more complex than the one before. And I think this points to the idea of contextualization. So contextualization, and Vinod tried to point there to this, is extremely important, but there are contextualizations of contextualizations. And I think the political / technical / empirical job that we have when you have a South orientation is to make sure that contextualization has as much texture as possible, a texture associated to that specificity that speaks clearly about, that is able to denounce that maldistribution of resources that was mentioned before, and is able to think things forward. Contextualization cannot be understood in a decontextualized manner. I suppose that's what I want to say. And in terms of the pandemic, sadly, we just, let's go and have a look at who is being vaccinated to date. I mean, the pandemic has been a terrible event, and sadly, as far as we have seen, it has not reversed the order as it should have.
Mm-hmm. Very good, thank you, Luis. We have 6 more minutes, and we have many questions. I took the liberty to select one that I think might touch upon all the presentations we've had today. So Carlos Rittel has congratulated you all for the very interesting event, and he would like to hear your opinion on the shift on global South debate with the increasing influence of major developing economies over less developed nations, in many cases replicating relations between rich and poor nations in colonial times. So although we do have 5 minutes, I think it's a very interesting question that maybe we could use to close our event today. And I would like to start with Vinod.
Yeah, thanks, Flavio. Yeah, with respect to the question, I think I've shared a lot of my experiences so far. So I think towards the end of the conversation, and also as a closing remark for myself, I think towards the end of the conversation here, discussion here, Flavia is going to introduce a publication that me and Arthur have worked on. And it's a collection of publication from 15 of our colleagues from different parts of the so-called Global South: Argentina, Ghana, Kenya, India, Vietnam, Kyrgyzstan, around the world, and from different sectors as well. So in a way, I mean, happy to share that soon. And in a way, I think that is going to answer the COVID-19 question more, and also about the question that just asked. Thanks. And thanks to everybody at IASS for this opportunity, for the time, and special thanks to my panelists, and super special thanks to my friend and colleague, Arthur Scambati.
Thank you very much, Vinod. Luciana.
It's our last talk, yes?
Sadly,
okay.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you again for everybody. I think again, it's the Global South. I think we can think about in terms of representation, political, cultural, epistemological representation. Regarding the political representation, this example of major developing economies over less developing nations matters, of course. So it's important to improve or change these spaces of the representation exercise. But I want to finish bring the question again of democracy. I think it's very important we think democracy in a non-liberal terms, and I think it is fundamental to the renewal of the post-colonial agenda itself. So because is in the global south that the necropolitics happened. We see this in Brazil now. So democracy, I think that we need to reconstruct the idea of democracy and decolonize even the idea of democracy to help us fighting against this structural massive destroy of our rights. So I think it's the important, the key concept that we need to look in the future. Yes.
Thank you very much, Luciana. Luis.
Thanks to the organizers for inviting us to discuss such an important concept and for being so generous with their time and the invitation as such. In terms of Carlos' point, is an excellent final question. So what to do with countries in the global south now behaving like old colonial masters? And I think this is something that we are grappling with in a big way as China becomes even more powerful as a result of the pandemic, and as the kind of this new international division of labor and shift of industrial power even in a more accelerated way towards Asia. This is something that is not going to be reversed, and it's going to stay with us. Now, a couple of things about that. This is not new. I mean, this is exactly what we saw during the decolonization period, in the early decolonization period in the Americas in the beginning of the 19th century, what we saw in the second half of the 20th century in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. We were colonial subjects, and then the next day we were elites of these countries took control and started to behave like the old colonial masters. So what is the next step? Well, the fight is on. I think that's jumping, abandoning the ship, because those contradictions will come up. It is not the way to go. I think my feeling is that's or my sense is that what invites us is to reorganize our relationship to the global south. And as we have been doing in these conversations, trying to immediately start finding or designing or developing or reorganizing our sense of new concepts. Before I mentioned most of the world as a new concept, and I find it's really important, but also people use the idea of the global precariat as another important concept. We all now, when we use the global south, we all will remember to say the south in the south and the south in the north, because we all know that there's a north in the south, and obviously, of course, there's a north in the north. So I think if we're going to take a lessons out of this conversation is to appreciate the enormous contribution that the idea of the global south have made to the social sciences, the humanities, and the sciences, as we can see in this conversation, and also a collective sense that it is important to keep the conversation live and going.
Thank you very much, Luis. I would like to thank all panelists who took their time to provide us such interesting inputs. The idea of Global South has been deepened, maybe not solved, as it's not a problem, but a concept that needs to be further developed, further studied, and brought to many of these discussions that we need to have in international politics, sustainability studies. And it's always very enlightening when we welcome people who do use the term, but in a very critical manner, understanding that it is fluid, it is powerful, and it can be changing. Let's all hope for that as well. So this event would not have been possible without the support of the research group, Democratic Reconfigurations of Sustainability Transformations from the IASS, also the fellow group of the IASS. Thank you so much for jumping on board with us. The group Brazil in Focus, made up of Brazilian researchers at the IASS. And we remind everybody that the study organized by Vinod and Arthur Sgambati, Sustainable Solutions for the Global South in a Post-Pandemic World, will be sent to all who have registered for the event. Also, we will receive a link to the report of the event, which we will publish in a couple of days on a webpage at the IASS website. So thanks everybody for taking part today, and I wish you all a very good week. Bye-bye.